In his poem, The Second Coming, William Butler Yeats famously describes the chaos of that event with the lines, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, and more anarchy is loosed upon the world." This same anxiety was expressed by Nietzsche a half-century earlier in a parable where a madman says that if God is dead, then we cannot tell which way we are falling. A couple centuries before that, René Descartes panicked that if the foundations of science are rotten, we cannot tell truth from falsehood. And we can go back centuries further to the pages of the Greek tragedy in Aeschylus, where the Furies lament that without the laws of the gods, violence will be the rule. The idea that there's something that the whole world depends on, either to exist, or to be knowable, or to be good, and then suddenly that thing vanishes, is a horror story. It's a philosophical horror story, which means that it doesn't immediately lend itself to fantasy tabletop role-playing, but as we'll see today, the adventure we're going to sketch out does dip its toe in those intellectual waters. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and we're going to talk about the Ravenloft Domain of Dread called Darkon. Right off the bat, no pun intended, there are two things to note about this gothic fantasy domain. First, unlike other Ravenloft Domains of Dread, Darkon features a plethora of high fantasy creatures. You won't find pixies or a dragon or a unicorn, say, in Falkovnia or Rishmulo, but you could find them in Darkon. But secondly, and more importantly, the land of Darkon is slowly disappearing. It is slowly crumbling and withering away and being consumed in an ever-expansive fog or mist. People who live in Darkon call that fog the Shroud, and fear of its coming is universal. Now, when you put these two things together, first that there are lots of fantasy creatures, and second that everyone lives in fear of the approach of an all-consuming fog that eats reality, you should immediately think of the 1984 fantasy film The Never-Ending Story, adapted from the book by Michael Ende. In that film, a number of fantasy creatures all live in fear of the Nothing, an eldritch presence that undoes reality. If you watch that film and attend to its more frightening elements, you'll get a pretty solid imaginative grip on what Darkon should feel like. As for why Darkon is crumbling into the mist and where the Shroud comes from, the answer lies in the official metaphysics of Ravenloft, or the metaphysics of the Domains of Dread. Each of the domains, after all, was created in order to imprison a horrible creature or monster. Barovia was created in order to imprison Strahd von Zarovich. Azalin was created in order to imprison Hazlitt, and so on. Darkon was originally created in order to imprison the wizard Lich King Azalin. However, Azalin found a way to escape. And now, with no function whatsoever, with no one to imprison, the domain of Darkon is just fading away, disintegrating into the Shadowfell. Now, we are going to incorporate these facts about Darkon and Azalin in the adventure that we're going to put together. It won't be hard for us because someone already wrote an amazing adventure with almost exactly that premise. That adventure is When Black Roses Bloom by Lisa Smedman for 2nd edition D&D Ravenloft. We're going to take that adventure and reskin certain elements using the tables from the section of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft called The Doomed Domain, and tell the story of how the player characters get trapped in Darkon and how they restore Darkon to substantiality by dragging Azalin back to his prison. This adventure is going to take PCs from levels 10 to 14, and it's going to proceed in 5 acts. In Act 1, the PCs will find themselves trapped in the domain of Darkon, and they will quickly learn about the nature of the domain, a little bit about Azalin, and what is necessary for them to escape. In Act 2, the PCs make a deal with Styrax, a night hag who has access to a machine called the Rift Spanner. They need access to the Rift Spanner in order to become incorporeal and thereby explore Castle Avernus that hangs phantom-like in the air. In Act 3, the PCs explore Castle Avernus, interacting with the ghosts of Azalin's servants, and they finally come across Azalin himself, or rather a vestige of his presence. They discover that he is using 3 magical mirrors to manipulate time and history. He is attempting to rewrite history so that he never came to the domain of Darkon ever, and it never existed to begin with. So, in Act 4, the PCs go into each of the 3 mirrors, thwarting Azalin's attempt to rewrite history and ensuring that history plays out the way that it was supposed to. And finally, in Act 5, having expelled Azalin from all the mirrors and trapped him in Darkon once again, the PCs must defeat him, destroy the mirrors, and escape the domain. So let's begin. We'll begin Act 1 in the way that many Ravenloft adventures begin, with the PCs becoming lost in the mists and eventually emerging in the land of Darkon. Darkon is a damp, verdant, forested land covered with lichens, mosses, and trees, and the fog is absolutely everywhere. On account of the low cloud layer, the sky is a bone white. The first thing the PCs should experience is an earthquake. For 5 solid minutes, the ground is going to shake and tremble, and DM should just get a reaction from each of the PCs. How do they handle this sort of situation? In the midst of the earthquake, the ground will crack open, revealing a rift of mist. PCs should feel free to investigate this rift. It turns out that the chasm goes down forever. It's a bottomless pit filled with the mists of the Shadowfell. These are just a couple initial events in order to get the mood of the place. And once the PCs become bored and move on, they will encounter a fleeing man screaming for help. He wears civilian clothing, he's got a set of spectacles perched on his nose, and he carries a series of parchments and codexes and scrolls rolled up underneath one arm. He's running, screaming for help, and he tells the PCs to look out as another earthquake occurs and the ground cracks open. This time, however, something arises from the misty chasm. Between 4 and 6 gallows speakers, they immediately attack the PCs. Once the PCs fight off the gallows speakers, the fleeing man introduces himself as Balthazar and expresses his gratitude. He says he's a researcher, and he explains that the entire domain is falling apart, the land is coming undone, something called the Shroud is eating away at every single rock and tree. The Shroud is a horrible fog. Wherever it moves in, it consumes. And he adds that it's not just the land itself that's disappearing, but people's memories of the land. People are beginning to forget their loved ones, who they are, where they live. Some people forget their own name, even. If the PCs express a desire to leave, Balthazar will lament that that's impossible. The Shroud surrounds all. Until there's some way to dispel or lift the Shroud, there's no way to leave Darkon. Believe me, he would leave too, he says. Now, it just so happens Balthazar is a researcher into the Shroud, and he thinks he's discovered some way to potentially lift it. The key, he explains, lies in Castle Avernus, where the Wizard King Azalin used to rule. A year or so ago, the castle floated into the air and with a flash of energy became incorporeal. That was around the time the Shroud showed up. The key to lifting the Shroud, therefore, must lie in Castle Avernus. During this conversation, Balthazar should give his notes to the PCs. Let them hold the notes as he gestures to different paragraphs and drawings. After he's explained all this, he suddenly forgets what he was talking about. He also forgets who he is, the fact that he was chased, the fact that the PCs saved him, and the fact that those notes that the PCs are holding are his. What's going on here? Who are you? Where am I? And Balthazar will suddenly become distrustful and want to leave. He's not going to take his notes back, he's confused, he doesn't know who the PCs are, he doesn't know why they're carrying weapons, and he insists on going off by himself into the mist. The PCs are now trapped in a domain, mired in a metaphysical mystery, and they're holding a stack of notes all about it. And one thing is clear, the only clue they have to go on is to travel to this Castle Avernus place. Fortunately, there's a map there in Balthazar's notes. As the PCs head off to Castle Avernus, they can encounter more earthquakes, more cracks in the ground, and more groups of gallows speakers that arise and attack from the mist. When the PCs get to Castle Avernus, they level up to 11. Act 2 begins with the PCs arriving at Castle Avernus. It hangs in the air like a phantom, ghostly, semi-translucent. Occasionally it glitches and flickers in the sky. Now in this version of D&D, especially by level 11, many of your player characters will be able to fly. Let them. The problem will become apparent pretty quickly. As soon as any player character overlaps with Castle Avernus or shares a space with it, they begin to take necrotic damage. Heavy necrotic damage. And they stop taking necrotic damage when they move out of the space of Castle Avernus. Exploring it simply by flying, therefore, should not be an option. After they've tried this, and after they've attempted to explore Castle Avernus in other ways, they should overhear a creaky, witchy voice saying, "Ah, there's only one way to explore the castle. It is through the use of the Rift Spanner, my invention." The speaker is Styrax, a night hag. She assures the PCs that she has a way to turn them incorporeal for 5 days, and that this incorporeal status would allow them to explore Castle Avernus. Their equipment, their weapons, everything would become incorporeal with them, and they would gain the ability to fly. She's willing to do all of this for them, if only the PCs help her in something. She wants a unicorn horn. And she knows of a place nearby where there's a unicorn. Now, of course, this is a gruesome demand, and the PCs might just want to try killing Styrax and using the Rift Spanner on their own. To discourage this option, I would give Styrax the statistics of the Lycan Lich from Candlekeep Mysteries and just change the creature type to Fey. If they get into combat, she won't try to kill them outright, just demonstrate that they are overpowered and then insist that they should take her bargain. As for taking the bargain, there are 2 options here, and they mostly differ on how sad the DM wants this adventure to be. The sadder option is for the PCs to find a normal, real unicorn, spirit of the forest, and either kill it or convince it of the nobility of their quest to save the land so that it lays down its life and lets them take its horn. The other option, which is less sad, is to let the PCs fight an evil unicorn or a shadow unicorn. Use the statistics for the corrupted avatar of LaRue from page 123 from Candlekeep Mysteries, and just give it 3 uses of legendary resistance, and also give it 3 legendary actions, one of which can be used on attacking, one of which can be used to move without provoking an attack of opportunity, and one of which can be used to heal 10 hit points. Either way, they'll end up with a unicorn horn, which they can give to Styrax, and then Styrax, in turn, will allow the PCs to use her Rift Spanner. At that point, they can level up to 12. At the beginning of Act 3, the PCs have traveled into Styrax's lair, and they have stood inside the Rift Spanner. It looks like a metallic gazebo with all kinds of runes scrawled onto it. When Styrax activates it, there's a thrumming noise, all the runes glow, and the sudden flash of light and a crack of sound as the PCs smell ammonia and suddenly find themselves floating, semi-translucent, and incorporeal. At this point, they fly up to Castle Avernus and explore it. Because they and Castle Avernus are incorporeal in the same way, they're going to interact with Castle Avernus as if it were a solid castle, just floating in air. As for the castle itself, we're going to use Kolot Towers from Waterdeep Dragon Heist. This is from the Winter chapter, the place where Manshun is associated with. We're going to use those tower maps as Castle Avernus, and we're going to change all of the regular monsters into incorporeal undead, such as gallows speakers, wraiths, specters, etc. The named NPCs, which talk, will change into Obzedat ghosts. These Obzedat ghosts are going to explain to the PCs what has happened. They're going to explain that Azalin last year acquired 3 magic mirrors, and that these magic mirrors allow Azalin to project himself back in time. Not only to project himself back there, but to rewrite portions of history, acting them out in different ways so that different events unfold. As for the history Azalin is rewriting, it concerns 3 crucial points. And here we're going to veer way off canon because we have our own past for Azalin. Now, originally, we're going to say that Azalin's history went like this. Azalin was originally a young man and a wizard king over a city called Nurl, and that city was conquered and sacked by a warlord named Strahd von Zarovich. This is before Strahd became a vampire. As soon as Strahd subjugated Azalin's city, he took Azalin and as a gesture of subjugation, turned Azalin into his court magician. He couldn't keep calling him Azalin though, because that name means Iron Crown, it's a regal title. So instead, he gave Azalin a new name, Kazan. Kazan the Fabulous, the court magician. Azalin despised this, but there was nothing he could do. So he played the role of court magician as he secretly built up his magical powers. Azalin accompanied Strahd and Strahd's armies into a land called Barovia, which Strahd conquered with equal ease. And later, when Strahd became a vampire, Azalin fled into the woods of Barovia, where he found a place to build a wizard's tower for himself. This is the Tower of Kazan from Curse of Strahd. Later still, when it became apparent that Azalin could not escape Barovia without considerable power, he traveled to the Amber Temple. There, using the powers of the Amber Temple, he ascended to lichdom, but the process destroyed his memory. He didn't know anything except for the fact that he was a lich, and so he gave himself the title Exithanter. Fortunately for him, a group of adventurers did come along and help restore his memory, and as soon as that happened, he wandered off into the mist, which took him as prisoner, and thus the domain of Darkon was created. This is the history of Azalin that the Obzedat ghosts will tell the PCs, and all around the castle the PCs should see portraits of Azalin, both as a young man and as an old sage before he became a lich. The Obzedat ghosts continue to explain that Azalin is using the 3 magic mirrors to affect 3 points in this history. First, he's rewriting the point of history where Strahd conquered his city, specifically retelling it so that he won and Strahd failed. Second, he's retelling the point in his history where Azalin fled Castle Ravenloft to build the Tower of Kazan. Instead, he's telling it this way, where he fled Castle Ravenloft to rally an army of elves to lay siege to the castle and destroy Strahd. And finally, concerning the period of history in which Azalin became a lich in the Amber Temple, he's rewriting that too, so instead he is the destroyer of the Amber Temple, someone who destroys the entire structure, unleashing forces of evil, and escaping in the mists in the wake of the chaos. By succeeding in all 3 fronts, by gradually rewriting these periods of history, Azalin is slowly escaping the domain, and as he slowly escapes the domain, it slowly ceases to be. Thus the shroud, thus the fall into nothingness. This is all the information the Obzedat ghosts give the PCs, and some of these ghosts are hostile and they will attack either while dispensing this information or right after dispensing this information. As the PCs continue to explore Castle Avernus and as they go up and up and up towards the throne room, they will eventually climb to the room with Azalin himself in it. Or rather, what they see is a ghostly throne and a vestige of Azalin that's flickering in and out of being. It stares straight ahead into the distance. It doesn't acknowledge their presence, and if the PCs try to interact with it at all, their hands and their weapons pass through it. Their spells cannot target it. Across from Azalin's throne, sure enough, there hang, suspended in the air, 3 glistening magical mirrors. When the PCs peer into any one of them, they do not see their reflection, but instead see some events from past history playing out, events that concern Azalin. When the PCs reach this point, have them level up to 13, and we are on to Act 4. In Act 4, the PCs together must enter each of the 3 mirrors, stop Azalin from rewriting history, and thereby force him out of the mirrors back into Darkon. In each case, the method is the same. The PCs collectively focus on one of the mirrors, and by so doing, they travel into it. Once they arrive, they will appear to be wearing clothes and carrying equipment that's appropriate for the setting, although of course this is just an illusion, and in fact they have their real clothes and equipment. Inside the mirror, a version of history will play out where Azalin is the good guy, or Azalin is the victor. It's a fake version of history, but by rewriting it this way, Azalin is escaping from Darkon. So the PCs must interrupt what Azalin is trying to do, cause him to lose. When this happens, they will spoil his fantasy and expel him from the mirror. When Azalin is expelled from a mirror, he has to wait 24 hours before he can try to re-enter it. This should allow the PCs enough time to expel Azalin from all 3 mirrors, at which point he will re-manifest in Darkon and be pretty furious. The first mirror is the one that's the most complex and has the most moving parts. It retells the story of Strahd von Zarovich arriving in the city of Nurl and sacking it, taking Azalin prisoner. Azalin is retelling the story so that he is an angelic king. He's got the statistics of a deva, and Strahd is not only a villainous warlord, but already a vampire with undead minions. And to tell this story as a template, we're going to use the events of Idleglen from pages 140 to 144 in Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. Here are the changes we're going to make to that event. First, we're going to replace the statue of Zariel with a statue of Azalin. It's a flattering statue with wings, depicting him as angelic, of course, and we'll say that the statue does radiant damage not to fiends, but to undead and to shadow dragons. We're also going to change the Church of Lathlander and the Priests of Lathlander into a Church of the Eternal Order and Priests of the Eternal Order, Azalin's own religion. Now, as scripted, the events of Idleglen have 4 stages, or 4 events. In the first event, we're going to replace each knoll with a skeleton astride a skeletal warhorse. We're going to replace each dretch with a shadow. We'll replace the giant hyena with a direwolf, and here's the best part, we're going to replace the Hezro with a zombie clot from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Giant wave of corpses. In Event 2, we're going to replace Garoknol the Marlith with a Death Knight. In Event 3, instead of going mad from Demon Ichor, the 5 guards become zombies because of their exposure to the zombie clot. Use the statistics for vampire spawn, however, to make the challenge level appropriate. And finally, in Event 4, replace Yinagu with Strahd. Use the vampire stat block, nothing fancy, astride a shadow dragon. As with the original events of Idleglen, this scenario will conclude with Strahd's defeat unless the PCs step in. The PC's goal here should be to stop Azalin from winning. That means either killing Azalin as soon as he swoops down to fight Strahd, or protecting Strahd and his shadow dragon from Azalin. Either way, once they ensure Azalin's defeat, the fantasy is spoiled, he's kicked out, and the PCs exit that mirror victorious. If, however, Azalin defeats Strahd, as scripted, then the PCs are just ejected from the mirror and there's no change and they must try again. We can also say that the PCs take their injuries and their conditions with them in and out of the mirror, so that if they die in one of these mirrors, they die in real life. Now, the second mirror concerns the period of history in which Azalin fled Castle Ravenloft in order to build the Tower of Kazan. In his rewriting of history, he doesn't flee to build the Tower of Kazan. Instead, he flees to the Elves of Barovia and makes a bid for leadership. And that's where the mirror deposits the PCs. The PCs appear to be Barovian elves in an encampment, and the entire encampment is listening to Azalin make a pitch for leadership. He's promising that, as an insider to Castle Ravenloft, he knows all of its weaknesses, he knows all of Strahd's weaknesses, and victory will be certain. In addition to making promises, however, he's also willing to demonstrate his leadership by defeating anyone in single combat. If the PCs don't interrupt, an elf who has the statistics of a guard captain agrees to fight one-on-one with Azalin, and because Azalin has the statistics of an Inquisitor of the Mindfire, the elf loses, and Azalin gains the confidence of all the elves. If events play out this way, the way that Azalin wants, of course, the PCs will be ejected from the mirror and they have to try again. So what the PC's goal should be is to stop Azalin from gaining the trust of the elves. They can try heckling him or arguing with him, they can try strengthening the position of the elf that agrees to fight him, or one of the PCs could agree to fight Azalin themselves. Any of those would be acceptable ways to spoil the fantasy and to eject Azalin from mirror number 2. The third mirror concerns the period of Azalin's history where he went to the Amber Temple and used its evil powers to become a lich. In this mirror, Azalin is rewriting history so that he never became a lich in the Amber Temple, but instead used his wizardly powers to destroy and burst open all of the amber sarcophagi therein. The PCs show up inside the Amber Temple, and they appear to be members of the wild nomadic mountain folk that live in the mountains of Barovia. They and the other mountain folk are being commanded by Azalin to lay down certain herbs, to lay down certain runes, and to lay preparations to basically blow up the Amber Temple. Many of the mountain folk are outright charmed by Azalin, but many are simply following because he has persuaded them of the goodness of his plan. Azalin here has the stats of an archmage, and the PC's task is simple: stop Azalin from laying the preparations to blow up the Amber Temple. They could do this by defeating Azalin in combat, or they could do this by convincing the non-charmed mountain folk to resist Azalin's orders. They might point out that in each of the amber sarcophagi there's something evil and it's trapped there, and that blowing up the Amber Temple would release it onto the land. If the PCs either defeat Azalin in combat, or successfully convince the mountain folk to stop helping him, then he is ejected from mirror number 3. Now, when Azalin is ejected from each mirror, he becomes more and more aware of the PC's presence, so that after being ejected from the first mirror, he is sitting straight up in his throne, staring ahead, moving his head about as though trying to perceive something that he cannot. After being ejected from the second mirror, he is walking around, pacing impatiently in his chamber, muttering to himself. And after being ejected from the third mirror, he accosts them and demands to know what their purpose is before he kills them. And the PCs level up to 14, and we go to Act 5. Act 5 is a straight-up confrontation with a lich, Azalin. He demands to know why the PCs ejected him from his mirrors and what they're doing there. Moreover, he plans to kill them as soon as they give their explanation. And here it's important to stress that there is no way whatsoever to persuade Azalin not to go back into the mirrors and not to continue escaping from Darkon. If the PCs point out that in his absence the land will disintegrate, he doesn't care. If the PCs point out that the disintegration of the land will result in many deaths and lots of suffering, he doesn't care. The only thing he cares about is leaving the land and escaping. So he and the PCs are at an impasse, and combat is, in a sense, inevitable. When the PCs fight him, you could use the stat block for a lich, but of course, lich stat blocks are very difficult and you should really customize it a bit more. Mike Shea, aka Sly Flourish, has a great piece and video on how to improve the lich for D&D. Or you might just take a specific lich whose stat block you like, or you might just take some other spellcasting monster that you like and you think would be level appropriate and just say it's a lich. As they battle, Azalin will laugh and declare their inevitable doom. I will return to the mirrors, he promises. I am attuned to them for as long as I have a body. Hopefully, however, the PCs will prevail, they will reduce Azalin to 0 hit points, at which point his body is destroyed, and the castle becomes solid again. Thousands upon thousands of tons of solid stone and rock, hundreds of feet up in the air, suddenly plummet down to the earth with an earth-shattering crash. The PCs, fortunately, are still incorporeal, so the castle should fall through them to the ground. Once it's fallen, the PCs can make a DC 20 perception check to verify that the mirrors were shattered in the process, and at that point, the shroud will begin to recede from Darkon. People will begin to regain their memories, and that includes Balthazar. If the PCs don't realize this themselves, Balthazar will run to the PCs and exclaim, "Aha! My plan worked! I knew that you would do it! But listen, it's only a matter of time before Azalin will be reborn. You have only a matter of time before the borders of this domain close. Quick, flee, and take me with you!" And thus the PCs should seize upon their opportunity to escape this domain, and thus the PCs level up to 15, and our adventure concludes. Now, of course, after being reborn from his phylactery, Azalin is going to swear eternal vengeance on the PCs and vow to send spies into the mists to hunt them down and kill them. They have, after all, ruined the possibility of his escape. So this adventure could have a sequel, in a sense. And that's our short adventure in Darkon, which takes PCs from levels 11 to 15. It's based very strongly in Lisa Smedman's When Black Roses Bloom, and I encourage you to read that module if you found this adventure idea interesting. But what do you think? Does this sound like a fun adventure idea in Darkon, or would you do something completely different? In your version of Darkon, for instance, is the presence of the Shroud due to Azalin's absence or to some other reason? Let me know in the comments. As always, thanks very much for watching this. Don't forget to click like and subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you want notifications whenever I upload new content to this channel, which I do every week. Thanks very much.